Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Opted Theology Podcast. My name is Andy Schmidt. I'm here with Brad Littlejohn, and we are here doing a podcast on Brad's book, "Why Do Protestants Convert?" I think this will be an interesting podcast. I think there's been a lot of people, including myself, who have been moving. A lot of young people have been moving kind of towards Rome, even into Eastern Orthodoxy, and because of a lot of issues that they see within the Protestant church, within evangelical churches, non-denominational churches. And so I'm very excited to do this podcast. I listened to the one that you did on Truth Unites with Gavin Ortland. I thought that was very interesting. So I was like, I got to get this book and see if I can get this guy on the pod. So before we start talking about the book, do you want to kind of tell people about who you are and what you do generally?
Yeah, sure. So I am the founder and until very recently the president of the Davenante Institute. Ran that for 10 years.
Hmm.
And this book is in many ways, this is published by Davenant Press. We've published over 40 titles over the past few years. And it sums up a lot of the rationale behind the work of the Davenant Institute, which is to provide an answer to evangelicals that are wrestling with disillusionment about their Protestant heritage, largely because they're ignorant of that Protestant heritage. So we at least want to introduce them to what they're ostensibly disillusioned about before they
Mhm.
use it as an excuse to jump ship. So the Davenant Institute is really engaged in recovering a lot of the resources of classical Protestantism and showing the
Yeah.
intellectual depth and richness of that tradition. So I've been doing that for a decade. I'm also a fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC and do a lot of research and writing for them.
Awesome. Well, I think before we get into some of the details of the book, I kind of want to just ask you generally what led you to and you kind of just said, what led you to writing a book like this, and kind of what patterns or what things have you seen in the younger generations that maybe it has led you to write this?
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to think when we originally it came out of a blog series that Chris Castaldo and I did together, but I think
Mm,
was back in 2019, probably
mm,
2018, 19. And that at that time I was teaching at Patrick Henry College in Northern Virginia, and PHC is one of these places that has this conversionitis phenomenon, as we call it. Hillsdale is definitely another one. Um, a lot of a lot of colleges that attract really bright uh, young evangelicals that are really interested in either certainly at college at those colleges they can then get exposed to history and to the liberal arts and to this whole wealth of great books they didn't know about. Many of them are interested in going into politics or positions of cultural leadership. And what I found, encountered there at Patrick Henry, and heard from both among some of the students I was teaching, and heard from professors about other students in recent years, and then had a number of friends at Hillsdale who were talking about the same thing, was just this trend that just the sort of the best and brightest of their students, the cream of the crop, were very often and very high, you know, a high percentage of them were converting to Rome during their time at the college or shortly afterward. And then you look around. This wasn't new on my radar. This had been on my radar for a while, but it was kind of I had been in North Idaho before that, and it's less of a phenomenon there. And there, the converts are more likely to go to Eastern Orthodoxy. We could talk about maybe some of the reasons
mm,
for that difference. But as I also got involved in kind of the conservative political scene in DC, you see almost everyone there is a former evangelical, but now Roman Catholic. It really is quite striking. So I said, what's motivating this, and how much of that is how much of that do we need to be critical of the converts for their motives, and how much do we need to be self-critical about the context in Protestant churches that is making this seem like the most plausible answer to these people.
mm,
Um, and I certainly we want to distinguish in the book between Roman Catholicism as a phenomenon and the conversionitis as a phenomenon. That is to say, You could think, I don't think this, but you could think that Roman Catholicism is perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with it per se. And if you grew up in that tradition, then fantastic. And yet, still think that there's something wrong with conversionitis, right? That
Mm,
you can you can pursue a good thing for the wrong reasons, right? Now, I actually think I still, as a Reformed Protestant, I think there are significant problems still with Roman Catholicism,
yeah.
but. Uh, the cradle Catholic who just grew up in that bothers me a lot less. And I know many of those people are good friends and devout people. That bothers me a lot less than a lot of the converts who are often, I think, converting for particularly unstable or short sighted reasons. And then the ones that aren't converting for unstable and short sighted reasons, that's also a concern. Because if you have a very smart, sober minded, mature person that says Reformed Protestantism isn't good enough, I need to jump ship,
Mm,
then that should make us as Reformed Protestants concerned. Say, what is it that we're doing wrong?
right.
So all of those things were kind of going into the background of why we wrote
Mm-hmm.
this.
For sure. So, I mean, you start with this thing in the psychology of conversion. You start with the authority hunger, and in this section, you kind of talk about the younger generation's desire for more structures and maybe safer authority. And I thought this was amazing. I mean, I'm growing up in the generation where 55% of my generation's parents are divorced. I mean, all the friends I grew up with were in broken homes. Very very messed up stuff, and so I thought this was like the perfect way to start. But I guess my question would be, what are some of the specific ways in which you see these younger generations are experiencing kind of disordered authority in their lives?
Yeah. So in the original draft of this, we actually wrote that section as father hunger, and I think for many it is very specifically a response to the phenomenon of fatherlessness. So many broken homes in modern society. I've known converts who grew up in broken homes who literally did not have a father in their lives at all, and the appeal of Roman Catholicism was very much related to that. Here is somebody who is a an authority figure whose word has weight, whose word compels obedience, who is this kind of stabilizing force in my life that I have otherwise lacked. And I think uh, we shouldn't. I mean, there's probably like actual sociological data on this that I don't have, but well, I don't know if there is or isn't, but it would be interesting to actually get sociological data on um, yeah, whether on how much there is in fact a correlation between if you grew up in a broken home and if you grew up in a
Mhm,
fatherless home, are you more likely to be drawn to this? But it certainly makes sense. And more generally, I think we could say, even for those who grew up in stable two-family homes, there is still a um, there's still an authority hunger in modern American life, right? Uh,
mhm,
Many of us might have had fathers who weren't particularly um, strong leaders, strong masculine leaders in our homes. We had a father there, but it sort of may have let himself get pushed around, or maybe our in our household that was fine, but in the church, our pastors didn't seem to really carry that much weight and authority. They seemed to be people pleasers. They were always chasing the newest fad. They're dressing in skinny jeans and trying to be, um, trying to be relevant. And they weren't someone who preached the word with authority, right?
mm,
And so and then, more generally, we're living in a society of rootlessness, a society in which every man does within what is right in his own eyes, in which there doesn't seem to be any agreed upon standard of right and wrong. And the Roman Catholic Church seems to provide that kind of rock of authority and stability and a conclusive answer to all of these questions that we have. So I think, sort of at
mm,
every level, just from like actual fatherlessness and the nuclear family to the kind of just vacuum of authority within Western society as a whole, you see all of that kind of pointing toward, at least,
mhm,
it can draw people toward the claims of the Roman Catholic Church in a sort of sense of an abstract ideal. To what extent
mhm,
that's actually the case in concrete parish life, I don't know. I hear different things. I think there are ways in
mhm,
which the Roman Catholic priest, who's you call him father, right, and he tries to relate to his congregation in that way. I think there are priests that really model that and exude that fatherly authority. And part of that is just the fact that they the Catholic priest is unmarried, he doesn't have his own family. He is not father to his own children, and so by that means he can be father to the congregation as a whole in a way that I think a Protestant pastor often can't be.
Hmm. So do you view that as and I mean you kind of talked about the fatherly aspect of it. So are you kind of viewing that as more as a fatherly void than necessarily a authoritative void? Because I mean I've seen both things. I think the fatherly void is obviously huge. A lot of people are broken up or growing up in broken families, and a lot of people without father figures, or if their fathers are there, they're not technically there. So I wonder, like, as I think through kind of my problems personally with evangelical churches or non-denominational churches, is that there's the 10 doctrinal statements, but then there's you could talk to 10 different elders at the church, and you'll ask them one question, and you'll get 10 different answers, and so there's one certainly lack of fatherly authority, but then there's also lack of doctrinal authority, and I wonder, do those two things kind of go hand in hand, or would you kind of put those in two different categories?
Yeah, I think it flows into that. I mean, that kind of relates to one of the points that we bring up in the theology section,
Right.
where the quest for certainty, right? So
Yeah. Right. Right.
that desire for epistemic authority that will provide a final resolution to all of our
Hmm.
questions about doctrine, all of our questions about ethics. How are we supposed to live as faithful Christians in this confusing society? Yeah, as you say, you get
Hmm.
100 different answers among 100 different people, and in Protestant churches, and you think, oh well, Rome, look, we know where to go. Like there's magisterium. Now, of course, in
Hmm.
practice, you talk to 100 different Roman Catholics, you'll get 100 different answers, and
Right.
even not even just at the lay level. There are very liberal Roman Catholic
Hmm.
cardinals, and there are very conservative Roman Catholic cardinals. They're more
Hmm.
liberal and more conservative popes. So the um,
Hmm.
the fact is, you're dealing with human beings who are finite and fallible and change their minds, and and struggle to interpret texts and so on. So the reality is, it's not clear to me at all that Roman Catholicism actually provides any more certainty or a stable base of epistemic authority than you can
Hmm.
find in a confessional Protestant tradition.
Okay.
Uh, but it's certainly understandable why people think that it might.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we could talk a little bit more about that when we get to the theology section. But I think one question that I had as it relates to this authority hunger is, and well, I guess what sort of, you kind of just talked about confessional Protestant churches, and that's probably one sort of combat to the lack of authority that young Protestants are seeing. Do you think that's kind of just the main way in which the Protestant church can maybe combat some of this movement towards Rome in younger people, is just subscribing to different confessionals or creating more robust, succinct doctrinal statements?
Yeah, well, I think we definitely need to get back in touch with our confessional heritage. This idea that we're just trying to kind of make it up as we go along. Every church has got its own, comes up with its own statement of faith. Every Christian college, every Christian school, it's like coming up with its own statement of faith.
Hmm.
And either reinventing the wheel, either they're doing it well and they're substantively well, but maybe like saying good things not quite as clearly or precisely as they could, or quite often they're sort of
Hmm.
unwittingly stumbling into heresies that have been dealt with centuries before. Uh, so having a confessional tradition means that the confession is not infallible, but it's far more likely to be truthful and clear
Hmm.
than something that was just cooked up by you know a, a few church planting friends yesterday, right? Uh,
Hmm.
Now that said, I think we need to be careful about saying confessionalism is the solution, because there is a way in which there's particularly in this rootless fluid context of modernity that we're in, and there's this craving for something solid to cling on to, that can breed a kind of confessionalism that is very unhealthy, right? Where someone is going,
Hmm.
looking to the confession. They might be drawn to Reformed Presbyterianism for the same reason that someone might be drawn to Rome, which is like, oh look, this is the place where you have all the answers. The Westminster Confession of Faith has all the answers. They settled it. I'm just need to submit my conscience to that. And what you're doing is you're making an idol out of a human locus of authority there, just as I think Roman Catholicism does. And also what you're doing is you're fooling yourself, because the reality is, even like the Westminster Confession of Faith is a fairly lengthy confessional document, but it's not like it answers everything. There's zillion, you could expand each of those paragraphs into a book, where in terms of all the different questions that might arise. And it's also just a confession of doctrine. It doesn't tell you about anything about ethics or even anything about church polity. This always cracks me up. Like, most Presbyterians don't realize Presbyterianism isn't actually in the Westminster Confession of Faith, because it doesn't even actually get to issues of polity, at least not beyond a few general things. So when we come to from credenda, what should we believe, to agenda, what should we do, the confessions aren't going to be that much help to us. And so I think the response needs to be a return to confessions, yes, but also cultivating a healthy humility, a rest. And this is where I think doctrine of justification by faith alone is so comforting, right? It's not that it gets us off the hook of doing good works, but it means we don't have to stress about, well, did I do everything right? You're not going to do everything right, but that's okay, because your failing fallen works are accepted as righteous in God's sight for the sake of Christ by faith alone, right?
Right. For sure. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think, well, and you talk about the holiness deficit disorder, which I feel like I have the holiness deficit disorder. As I was reading through it, I was like, man, this sounds very much like some of the stuff that I've been thinking through over the past year. And kind of, I guess as I've been working through my own conversion out of non-denominationalism, I've found comfort in a more, and I don't even know what to call it, just this more sacred service. And it was Anglicanism for me. I read J.I. Packer's book, The Heritage of Anglican Theology, about a year ago, which started to help me move the needle towards something that it just felt more sacred in the church service. And I don't know exactly how I should deal with that mentally, because there's nothing theologically sound about that, because there's obviously the verse in 1 Corinthians 3:16 that says, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells within you? And I think this is the classic evangelical argument as to like, well, then, what is it in the younger generations or in me that is being pulled towards this sacred church service? And so I'm going to ask I'm saying a lot right now, but I wonder if it's some sort of materialism. I mean, do you see that there's some sort of materialism in that sort of draw towards this more sacred or more holy service? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on there. I mean, the first thing to say, in part, you're dealing with a timeless human phenomenon. Human beings want to feel like they're in the presence of something transcendent and mysterious, something bigger than them, something that they can't understand in a way. So the a and this is so that's a natural human impulse, but and you see that in the way worship functions in every society and every tribe on the face of the earth. Now, it can be a corrupt human impulse. It can easily go too far, because and it does tend to, right? Because then there's this sense of valuing something merely because it's mysterious, and it doesn't actually really communicate any content. And so this is what the reformers were reacting against, right? You had this worship that was very mysterious, like you didn't even understand what the priest was saying, right? You're just sort of in there. You just got some incense, maybe you got some beautiful music in another language, and the priest is up there, muttering away in Latin, and you can sort of feel like you have holy feelings, but absolutely no content to that being conveyed, right? Where Christianity is a religion of the word. It's a religion about preaching, fundamentally about conveying true a true story about what God has done and the meaning of that, right? And so Protestantism says, whoa, we need to get this. We need to focus our worship on clarity and communication, and we need to put it in the vernacular languages. The focus needs to be on preaching. We need to get rid of rituals that people are doing. They have no idea why they're doing the thing. It just kind of feels cool. Get rid of all that stuff. And so for the most part, it was a move in a healthy direction. But then it can go too far, and it tended to um, some in some places within the Reformation itself, and certainly in the centuries following, where then you get the Enlightenment tries to push this impulse even further. And it says, well, the problem with the Reformation is it didn't reform enough. We still
Mm.
had these sacraments things, and what the heck's going on there? And we had this doctrine of the Trinity. It doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. So what we need to do is continue the Reformation and get to where we have a purely rational faith, where we're just like, you know, just accessing God just as we would, you know, study Newton's laws of motion,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and we live downstream of that kind of flattening out, which the Enlightenment rationalism was one way of doing it. But there was also a kind of more subjective emotionalist way of doing it, which says we want to make God maximally accessible. So there was an impulse, I think, in the 18th and 19th centuries to make God maximally accessible, right?
Mm.
And there was one way was to do it maximally accessible to our reason, and then there's another that was maximally accessible to our emotions. And that's what you see particularly in American Protestantism, right? Is to say
Mm.
God shouldn't be scary and foreign and other. He should just be totally relatable, like your best friend. And I think so many people are now growing up in the wake of generations of that, where it's like, no,
Mm.
I'm glad it's good having a best friend, but sometimes you need something bigger
Right.
um, than that. And I want a God who's actually too big for me to wrap my mind around. And the
Mm.
worship that I'm getting is not giving me that.
Yeah.
So I think that explains a lot of the draw. And I think, um, and I'm sorry, I risk going on to here, but I'll just I add to that. Even outside of the church, within society as a whole, we live in this sort of mass democratic age where anything that might seem sort of elevated and sacred has been kind of hollowed out, right? I mean, even
Yeah.
like a graduation ceremony at a university would have used to have a sort of solemnity and ceremony to it
Mm.
that it's not going to have now. And so there's that craving
Mm.
for that, and it's a healthy craving. But again, we got to be careful that we don't go too far back the other direction and we start valuing things just because they're mysterious and they kind of give us the tingles.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I mean, I think about Jesus, his actual ministry on earth with for the vast majority of those 3 years, they had no idea what was going on. I mean, he's constantly being like, like, I just healed a bunch of people, or I just made the winds and the waves calm down. You guys still can't see what is right in front of you. In a rational sense, I mean, they could not understand what was happening. I don't want to draw too much of a connection because I really I'm trying to work through this whole dynamic right now. What is a healthy view of mysticism or mystery, rather than, maybe not mysticism, but what's a healthy view of mystery, compared to how much do I need to rationally understand about Christ? And it's just a real confusing thing because, yeah, if you grow up in evangelicalism, there are certain answers to everything, and sometimes they go too far to where, like, yeah, you can't fully explain rationally what the Trinity is, no matter how hard you try. I don't think you can fully rationally explain it. And so how am I, like, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but how are you supposed to, I guess, how are you supposed to, I don't know, what's the healthy balance? I don't know if you have a, of a good answer for that, but what is that balance?
Yeah, well, then that gets back to some things I was saying about certainty, right? That
Mm.
rightly understood, the confessional tradition is a way of setting bounds. Like it's fencing off the mystery to keep us from trying to penetrate too deeply into it. That's what it's actually doing. It's not erasing the mystery; it's protecting the
Mm.
mystery. Um, you know, the
Sure.
the Chalcedonian definition. You know that Christ is these two natures
Hmm.
without confusion, without mixture, without confusion, without separation, without change. Like how on earth is that? How is that possible? Well, we don't know how that's possible. It's saying, well, it's not this. Like we could resolve the mystery in this way. We could say that the two natures are completely separate from each other in two persons. Well, nope, that would resolve the mystery, but that would be wrong. Or we could resolve the mystery by saying they're just fused into each other, into like
Right.
uh, like a chemical compound, like
Mm-hmm.
which Eutychianism does. Well, that would resolve the mystery, but that would be wrong too, right? So we affirm these things. And we know this to be true, and this to be true, and this to be true. We don't know how they're all true, and that's okay, right? And I think that for me was very freeing when I realized, oh, that's what our confessional tradition is doing. Um, it's not trying to give us all the answers. It's trying to give us all the things that we need to hold together somehow without
Mm.
necessarily understanding how they hold together. Because how could we? We're dealing with an infinite, and we're finite beings trying to talk about infinite being by like
Mm.
the only way we could possibly make sense of it is by getting it wrong. So
Right. No, yeah, that makes sense for sure. And I want to get into the theology of conversion, because I mean, there's a lot of stuff here, and your points here I thought were really interesting. The first point that you kind of talked about was the quest for certainty, and we've talked a little bit about that already. And I kind of wanted to ask if there was is there any sort of distinction that you would make between maybe a quest for certainty compared to a quest for clarity? And I know that I'm not necessarily coming out of I wasn't Presbyterian, or I'm not coming out of a confessional Protestant church. And so my context is non-denominational, lack of clarity anywhere. Have you found, or have you noticed any sort of distinction between people looking for clarity going to Rome, maybe people looking for certainty going to Rome, people looking for clarity maybe going towards confessional Protestantism?
yeah, that's a good distinction. Haven't really thought about it in those terms, but I think that's an important distinction because I think yes, that searching for clarity isn't necessarily the same as searching for certainty. A lot of in my life, a lot of doctrinal clarity has taken the form of clearly distinguishing those things that we're supposed to be certain about, fairly small
Yeah.
list, from all the things that we're not supposed to be certain about. um, so you can be fine. You can be fine with uncertainty as long as you're clear what you're supposed to be uncertain about, right? Um, so I think yes, I think that confessional Protestantism um, can appropriately pursued offers us a way of achieving great doctrinal clarity, without providing necessarily all the certainty that we want. Particularly, as I said, we make the distinction between credenda and agenda. The reformers were very they said, look, on the realm of agenda of things to be done, the Catholic Church has tried to give all kinds of detailed guidance in the form of all the canon law and all the ways that you're supposed to go through, do penance, and so on and so forth, so that in theory you could just sort of consult the rule book for any question and know, okay, cool, check, 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 check. All right, good. I pleased God today, right? And that's again,
Right.
that's natural human temptation. Pharisees were doing that in the time of Jesus, and we have to say no, it doesn't work that way. Um, so the reformers were actually saying, no, it's fine to have actually a lot of uncertainty about how you're wake up each morning. How do I please God today? I'm not sure. Go to sleep each night. Did I please God today? I'm not sure. And yet I do know that because my imperfect works are accepted by faith, that God is pleased with me, right? Um, so yes, so I think pursuit of clarity, pursuit of certainty, different things, and the certainty that Rome promises is ultimately a elusive one.
Oh,
Elusive,
100%.
elusive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's very shaky. It's very faulty. I mean, it's so I'm reading this other book. I don't know if you've ever read this. It's called the Roman Catholic Theology and Practice and Evangelical Assessment by Greg Allison. It's really interesting. He
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
just
I've heard of
puts
it. Yep.
yeah, it's really it's just a Catholic theology right next to evangelical theology, and I think that there is within the Catholic theological framework a lot of faulty or just blatantly unbiblical viewpoints, as far as I can tell, and so no, I think that you're right on that. Yeah, the only reason I was wondering is just because the thing that I've been kind of thinking about as it relates to this question of clarity versus certainty is that, and maybe this isn't the case for everybody, but a lot of the young people that I talk to oftentimes are just looking for some sort of presupposition to build their faith upon rather than an answer for every specific question. Whereas like
Mm,
they can get up in the morning understanding that they subscribe to a certain set of doctrines. Maybe they don't think this every morning, but they understand this implicitly that they've subscribed to a certain set of doctrines and therefore can try to proceed out of those doctrines in a way in their life that is pleasing to God, and not necessarily saying like, okay, do I give my money to this? Should I give my money to this organization or should I give my money to this one? There's not necessarily an answer, a theological answer for that sort of question in giving. But if you have a theological presupposition based on biblical doctrine or confession, you might be able to make a wiser decision on the basis of what your conviction is. Um, and I do think that sometimes Catholicism can be, in a way, the Catholic doctrine can be, in a way, a cop out to not think through. The Catholic theology assumes way too much
mhm.
theologically, and so it's like, okay, well, that seems like a little bit of a cop out to me, but I don't know. So I think that that's an interesting dynamic there. Now, okay, so you talk next about being in touch with history. In this section, you kind of discuss the Catholic view of history and the important significance they give to theological tradition and history. Can you break this section down a little bit, and just kind of give an overview as to what exactly is the holdup for Protestants as they think through the theological history?
Yeah, so the history thing. I mean, I think this is one area where uh, modern evangelical Protestantism has just come fallen a long way from what was going on in the Reformation, and we miss that sometimes because we say, well, it's all about sola scriptura. The Reformers were all about sola scriptura, so they wanted to get back to just the Bible, and so that means skipping over all this church history where people get it wrong and just going back to the source. Uh, and so, therefore, we today we don't really need to know much church history as long as we know our Bible. That's true. Study of church history is just a study of how human beings have messed it up, right? And that's not how the reformers thought about it. To say sola scriptura meant Scripture is the only finally authoritative source against which other claims must be tested. Uh, but you didn't discover the meaning of Scripture just by looking at it in isolation. You discover the meaning of Scripture precisely in studying Scripture in relation to all these later interpretations, right? And then by that you figure out which interpretations illuminate the text and which ones pervert the text, right? So Scripture and the later writings of the church are always to be looked at together, and the reformers are constantly citing the church fathers, um, and they're also citing medieval theologians, and especially as you get beyond the Reformation, the earliest decades of the Reformation, you have Protestant thinkers that are much more comfortable citing medieval scholastics, like Thomas Aquinas, and so there's this sense that the whole history of the church is ours to inherit and benefit from, and there's parts of it, of course, that are corrupt traditions, and bad doctrines that need to be reformed. But we still need to know those. We still need to study even the parts that are bad, and there's a huge amount that's good, right? So that's
Mhm.
how the reformers approached it, and I think the what we have nowadays in so much Protestantism is just a complete ignorance of everything after after
Yeah.
the Revelation 22. Okay, Revelation 22 skip from that up until John MacArthur founded his church in 1970, whatever, right? I don't know.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
um, not to pick on John MacArthur per se, right? Just to say, like,
No.
you get these kind of influential church founders that then create this network of churches, and that's the founding of that movement is the only church history that people know, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
again, this is a sense in which we're picking on the church, we're picking on American Protestantism, but it's a larger cultural phenomenon, right? We live in a society that is cut off from its history in so many ways, and there's
Yeah.
a sense
Right.
that why do we need to know history? Because you know uh, we have all this technological progress. Like, we know a lot more than they did, right? So what's
Mm.
the point of looking at what
Right.
they knew?
Right.
Um, so Yeah, so we live in an anti-historical age, and I think many young people are um, just realize how rootless and alone that makes you feel. Right? If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going,
Mm.
and so I think I see that very often is someone grows up in that non-denom evangelical church, does like a great books program. They start reading Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas, and they're like, wow, man, I didn't know any of this stuff. The
Yeah.
Catholics are talking about it. We are not talking about it. I guess I need to become Catholic, right? Which
Mm.
is not a very it's not a very sound
Yeah.
syllogism,
Yeah.
but it's it makes sense.
Yeah. No, and I always thought it was funny growing up when I would ask a theological question. I would ask, whatever it was, and I would get an answer from somebody in the church, whether it was a youth group leader, a pastor, or whatever. And I would always want to push as to, well, then where did you come to that conclusion? There's a lot of theological, biblical questions that you can ask where people can come to a multitude of different answers that are all within the bounds of maybe traditional orthodoxy. And I would ask, like, okay, well, where did you come to that? Well, then they would say, well, this is, essentially in some ways like I've been convicted into this, or this is kind of my interpretation or where I've come to. So it was a very personal conviction focused answer. And then I would push even further. And then the next thing they would do is start quoting historical theologians that they, or not even historical. It's like, here's what John Piper said, or here's what whatever has J.I. Packer said, or something like that. Here's what John Owen said. And I was always like, this just seems hypocritical at the end of the day. It seems like hypocritical for evangelical, low church evangelical non-denominationalists to say, this is, we're sola scriptura until we get pushed far enough to the point where we have to
Yep.
give you a,
Yep.
I mean,
No,
it's wild.
it's absolutely right. And Richard Hooker talks about this,
Yeah.
my favorite theologian, and just that Puritans he was interacting with in his day would do this, like, well, you're just saying that on human authority. We shouldn't take any human authority, scripture alone,
Yeah.
and then next thing you know, you turn around and find them, quoting, and here's what John Calvin said in defense, right? So, every human being relies on human authority. We all do. And it's just a question of whether we do so thoughtfully or thoughtlessly, and whether we are discerning about which human authorities we pay attention to, right?
Mm.
So the to say, you know, not going to listen to human authority, just going to listen to the Bible, that really just means you're only going to listen to human authorities that around in your lifetime, because you're gonna be listening to those anyway. Everybody is, and
Mm.
everyone's views are going to be shaped by those. They just don't think about it. So it's the question is not whether, but which.
Yeah, and there's a real reality to sola scriptura that if you believe sola scriptura completely and thoroughly, there would really be no point for you to go to church, to small group, to Bible studies, to listen to your pastor. These are all just in some ways just convictional or interpret. You're just listening to other people's interpretations, which could be contaminating to your
And you should
personal.
make sure to get a Bible without any study notes.
And in the original Greek and Hebrew, don't go too far to these translations. But no, I've always found that to be kind of a hypocritical way in which I think it's a pretty easy fix, for evangelicals who have a really succinct, robust historical theology. I mean, there's really, really good evangelical theology, and um, that is based on some sort of, like you're saying, human authority. And I think that seems like kind of an easy, I don't want to say easy fix. It's never an easy fix, but maybe would be kind of more humility focused and saying like, yeah, we do, I do subscribe to a Calvinist perspective or whatever, John Calvin. I agree with him. And so, no, for sure. And I want to, obviously, as we wrap up here, I want to ask, we can't go through all of the points, although I think that people should buy the book and read through all the points. I think they're really interesting. But I want to kind of ask, what, as you wrapped up this book, you kind of have the ending section. What were your concluding thoughts and kind of your way forward for the church and how the Protestant church, and how they should respond to so many people kind of moving to Rome?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I say in the afterword, I think is a kind of diagnostic framework we need to use is, I talk about that there are, so we have three chapters on three different sorts of motivations, but there's another kind of division of three that we could use, and say
Mm.
that uh, all right, are people? There are there are some things that draw people that are goods that are genuine goods that they are seeking in Rome, um, that
Mm.
could also be found within Protestantism, and so
Right.
the conversion is therefore needless on that ground, because if that's what you want, hey, like we've got that too. You just haven't done your homework enough, right?
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, for instance, on sacramental theology, that's one that we haven't touched
Yeah.
on, right? There is a rich heritage of sacramental theology within Protestantism, uh,
Hmm.
that I mean, yeah, not that there aren't some differences between Catholic and Protestant sacramental theology, but for the most part, they're really on finer points that most people aren't really even thinking about, like the exact differences between transubstantiation and the reformed
Like
reformed real presentation, as I sort of call it. But
consubstantiation. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, or consubstantiation, right? They're just thinking, well, like Rome has a you know real objective sacramental grace, and we don't. Well, no, actually, Protestantism has a vision of real objective sacramental grace, right?
Right.
So there's real goods that people are seeking, and they're just like they're um, they're not looking within their own contexts enough before concluding that Rome has those answers.
Hmm.
There's some things that they are seeking, things that are good in a sense, but they're not real. They're goods that aren't actually attainable within this life, right? And so that's why the sort of quest for certainty stuff kind of can fit into that,
Right.
where somebody is longing for a vision of truth, that is more truth than is actually going to be available to us in this life, or unity, right? That's what else we talk about in the book. This the church is so divided,
Huh.
um, and we really want a church where that is truly one
Yeah.
body, and Rome has that. But then it's like, well, no, actually, Rome doesn't have that, right?
Right.
There's all these divisions in Rome too, and so on. So that's real. It's a good, but it's not a real good, right? So
Mhm.
there's real goods that we have too. There's goods that they don't have and nobody has, and then there's things that they have, that we don't have, and we would say, yeah, but those aren't good. And
Mm.
so that's where, for instance, some of the stuff we were talking about with the the holiness deficit disorder, right, where
Mhm.
there is this desire to, I mean, for instance, the prayer to the saints, right? It's this
Mm.
I can understand why somebody would want that sense of, again, there's this, like, the part of the mystery. You ask them, well, how is that possible? Like, how is it, what are the actual mechanics by which the saint hears your prayers, or something like that? And it's sort of like, well, this is this mystery, and the mystery is kind of part of the point of it, right? But it's also this sense of continuity, like, I want to feel really connected to the
Mm.
you know the church of the
To the
past, and,
past,
and the
yeah.
idea that this really holy person is praying for me. It's very comforting. I mean, like, again, like, I can say, yeah, that makes sense why you would want that. I just think it's wrong. The
Yeah, it
Bible
also
doesn't
just
teach that
seems
to us, and it
arrogant.
and it pulls us away from Christ, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah. So I think, that's what I want to kind of sort through and say, there are reasons for conversion, good reasons. They're good things, but you don't need to convert to
Mhm.
get that. So just study your own
Sure,
heritage better. There's things
sure.
that I understand why you want that, but you need to, like, nobody has that, and there's things that they have that, but here's why Protestants have historically said it's wrong, and why we still need to say it's wrong. And
Mm.
so I think we need to, be willing to, on the one hand, pastorally, and if you're counseling, or friends with someone who's going through this, is you need to not pull the punches on some of the stuff. You need to
Mm.
say, look, Rome is in error, and this could be dangerous to your soul,
Mhm.
which is an unpopular, that's judgmental. We're not supposed to be judgmental nowadays.
Mm.
But I think you can also be very, uh, winsome in saying, look, I totally understand why you'd be drawn to that. I struggle with that itch too.
Mm.
But here's how I think actually Protestants historically have scratched that itch, and it's a more ultimately a more satisfying and faithful way of doing so.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's all obviously really helpful. And I mean, we didn't get to the conversation of being tired of division. And that is one that you hear all the time. It's like, and what I hear when people say they're tired of division, I just hear the whole like, why can't everybody get along thing. You got to view that like marriage, where if Jordan Peterson talks about a divorce is just 10,000 arguments that never happened, basically, that are all culminating in this one passive, cowardly act of divorce. And so the idea that a group of people aren't going to argue and have differentiations and distinctions is just wildly outside a comprehensive view of human nature. I think it's just very ignorant at the end. But there's so many good points. I wish we could just keep talking, but you got to get going here, and it's no problem. I do want to say thanks for coming on the podcast, and this is an interesting conversation. I think people should get this book, Why Do Protestants Convert, and just read through it, because I do see this continuing. I think more young people are going to continue to try to go to Rome, and if Protestants don't have good answers or good understanding of what's happening, I think we're going to have a lot of people go towards a theological conviction that might not be good. Well, depending on how you look at it. So thanks for coming on, Brad. I don't know if you have any final things you want to say, but thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cool. And if you're listening to this, you like this podcast, make sure you like, subscribe, share this with your friends, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.